for joining us for today's rig market webinar. My name is Afrona, and I'm joined today by Matthew, Head of Rig Market Research here at Esgian. Today, Matthew will be sharing valuable insights into the floating rig market in the Americas. For those attending for the first time, please note that all the data presented is sourced from our market intelligence platform, Rig Analytics, which monitors the entire global offshore rig fleet. If you're curious to explore the platform and its data capabilities further, feel free to send us a message and we'd be happy to walk you through it. This session will run for approximately 30 minutes and will dedicate some time towards the end to answer your questions. You can submit them anytime via the Q&A chat box. A recording of the webinar and the presentation slides will be shared with all attendees tomorrow. We hope you find today's presentation both informative and valuable. Let's get started. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Afrona, and thank you all for joining us today in our presentation, Floating Rig Market in the Americas, Key Regions for Deepwater Demand. My name is Matthew Donovan, and as I said, I'm Head of Rig Market Research for Esgian. Going through our agenda today, we'll start with an overview of major regions in the Americas, including South America, the US Gulf. We'll look at some utilization and contract activity in each region, then move on to regional outlooks for what lies ahead for the floating rig market through the Americas, ending with a comparison of the Americas with the global rig market. Moving on to our first slide. Floating rig markets in the floating rig demand in the Americas has remained strong over the past year. This has largely been buoyed by continued activity with Brazil with state oil company Petrobras, with strong contributions from activity in the US Gulf and in Guyana. As we look, we have seen some slight declines in the number of rigs actually drilling in late 2024, but due to continued activity in South America, this has slowly risen until August 2025, showing strong demand remaining in the region despite a challenging year for the global offshore rig market. South America remains the linchpin for floating rig activity in the Americas and for the globe. Demand in the region has risen over the past several months, with the number of rigs drilling and under contract both increasing, leading to increased competitive utilization compared to earlier this year, with competitive utilization reaching close to 90% as of August 2025. Activity in this region has been boosted by Petrobras in Brazil, which remains the single largest client for floating rigs at this time. In addition to Petrobras's activity, we have seen continued demand from ExxonMobil in Guyana, with rigs working at the Stabroek block year-round. Recent contracting in the region has also focused on upcoming activity in Suriname, where exploration development programs will be ongoing in coming years. Turning now to the US Gulf of Mexico, where we have seen some near-term declines in activity. Demand in the region began trending down from in late 2024, with some recovery in early 2025. Since then, drilling activity in the US Gulf, which is concentrated around primarily 7th generation drill ships, has declined somewhat as a result of many rigs on long-term contracts or those on short-term rolling off, with future activity concentrated in work that begins in 2026. So we have seen the number of contracted rigs start to increase in recent months as operators have been contracting rigs for long-term programs in the US Gulf in 2026 and beyond. So we should still see a solid amount of demand in the US Gulf. But in response, we have also seen, with the recent decline in demand, some rigs preparing to leave the region for work elsewhere. Other areas of the Americas have been relatively quiet in recent years in terms of floating rig activity, and this includes very limited activity in Central America and the Caribbean, Mexico, and Canada. However, as we shall see in some upcoming slides, we do see the potential for some activity to increase in those areas. However, demand will remain centered around South America and the US Gulf. Looking first to the floating rig outlook for South America, we see an impetus for continuing strong demand in South America. Not only do we have a number of long-term contracts with Petrobras still in effect, and others that will begin over into 2026, Petrobras has also begun tendering for rigs to replace those rolling off contract. So we have seen Petrobras tender for floating rigs to work at the Mero and Búzios fields offshore Brazil. In addition, we have also seen tenders from non-state oil companies there, including from Shell and Equinor. Karoon have all begun tendering for floating rigs to work in Brazil in the near to medium term, which should boost activity in the region. Utilization in the area will typically remain high, as rigs do not tend to, as non-locally owned rigs will not tend to remain in South America when not in use. Demand was also expected to be boosted by recent news of BP's Boomerang discovery offshore Brazil, which could potentially lead to further exploration activity in the region. Other boosters to floating rig demand in South America include the continued activity in Guyana with ExxonMobil and the upcoming programs offshore Suriname, including the Grand Morgu development. Rigs have been hired for that work and will be moving to the region to begin that work in late 26. There is also some small amounts of demand from areas including Colombia and potentially activity offshore Argentina and Peru in coming years. However, the focus in the region will remain on Brazil, with Petrobras as the major operator in the region. Activity in South America is split between drill ships and semi-submersibles, and we do see continued demand for semi-submersibles and sixth generation units in South America, although other regions and South America have shown a continued preference for seventh generation units in recent contracting. Looking at the US Gulf, in the near term, we do expect demand in the US Gulf to decline, with rigs continuing to roll off contracts and limited near-term spot activity. However, long-term contracts beginning in 2026 will boost demand in the region, while utilization is expected to be brought back into balance as rigs leave the US Gulf for work elsewhere. In the coming months, we will see drilling rigs relocate from the US Gulf to Mexico, to Egypt, and to the Black Sea. There could be some continued movement of rigs out of the US Gulf to meet demand in other parts of the world. The US Gulf, South America, and West Africa form part of a golden triangle, and we do expect to see continued movement between those three regions, with excess demand in the US Gulf likely to be absorbed by upcoming increases in activity in South America and West Africa. Looking at the rigs leaving the region, we will see a continued movement towards a seventh generation drillship heavy market in the US Gulf, with activity clustered around these high spec units. US Gulf has some of the newer and more high spec units on the market working there, and we do expect to see that activity to continue, particularly with the complexity of some of the ultra deep water projects we see in the US Gulf going forward. Outlook in the US Gulf could also potentially be boosted by the continued presence of offshore lease sales. The US Department of the Interior has currently scheduled lease sales in the US Gulf through until 2040, although incoming administrations may not stick to this schedule. It does show at the moment government support for long-term drilling activity offshore in the US Gulf. Turning now to Mexico. Mexico could see some improvement in activity, but the outlook in the region is likely to be limited by continued financial problems by Mexico's state oil company, Pemex. Pemex has had issues with payment towards oilfield service providers, and in recent years has almost exclusively focused on boosting activity in its shallow water fields, primarily with jackups. So we've seen very little floating rig activity from Pemex in recent years. Going forward, we do expect a semi-submersible to begin work in Mexico at some point in late 2025 or early 2026. And going forward from that, the Mexican government's new plan for Pemex does involve exploration and production from deepwater fields, including the potential development of the Zama and Lakach fields, which could boost the demand for floating rigs in Mexico. In addition to Pemex, we do have a number of independent operators that could potentially bring demand to the region. Starting next year in the first quarter, we will see a drill ship move to Mexico for Woodside's Trion development. In addition to that, there are potential for exploration and appraisal drilling, potential development drilling from companies including Eni, Harbour, and Repsol that over the next few years could bring further floating rigs to Mexico. Mexico may be a mix of drill ships and available semis in the region in terms of future demand. Including some lower cost options when it comes to semi-submersibles. However, the outlook for Mexico will be tempered by the financial restrictions on Pemex and by the economic uncertainty of some of the larger developments there. Looking ahead, the floating rig outlook for Central America and the Caribbean and Canada. For Central America and the Caribbean, we have seen very limited activity in recent years. However, we do have rigs contracted for work offshore Trinidad and Tobago next year. In addition to that, ExxonMobil recently signed a production sharing contract for activity in deepwater areas offshore Trinidad and Tobago. The company will drill at least one exploration well in the region, and there is potential, depending on the results of this well, for continued exploration and appraisal drilling offshore Trinidad and Tobago over the next several years. Potentially, we would likely see ExxonMobil use rigs from that have previously been used in its Guyana activity, brought to Trinidad and Tobago to meet any future demands in the region. In addition, Trinidad and Tobago also provides another outlet of demand for rigs that have also worked in South America and the US Gulf. Outside of Trinidad, there is potential for further drilling in Jamaica and the Bahamas. However, this activity remains speculative, as it will require further extensions of current drilling leases. Turning to Canada, While part of the Americas, the activity in Canada is generally focused around harsh environment semi-submersibles, which would likely be sourced from the markets in the North Sea. In Canada, we do have an operator currently looking for a rig to carry out year-round work in Canada, which could involve development, drilling, and P&A work at several older developments. In addition to that, another operator is also considering some offshore activity, some offshore exploration and appraisal activity in Canada. In the longer term, we'll likely not see any rigs in Canada before 2026. We're seeing that demand likely to come in 2027 and beyond, and timing of that activity could push further into the future, particularly based on project economics. Looking now, we have floating rig demand in the Americas versus the rest of the world. The Americas makes up a significant chunk of floating rig demand globally. Drillship demand worldwide is centered in South America and the US Gulf. But we do see higher numbers of semi-submersible activity boosting the floating rig count elsewhere, particularly in the North Sea and in the Far East with activity offshore China. So while there is a roughly even split in floating rig activity in the near term, with the rest of the world slightly outpacing the Americas in 2026 for those markets, before it balancing back to around a roughly 50-50 split before the end of 2027. It would be important to note that the majority of drillship activity remains clustered in the Americas, with semi-submersible activity making up the majority of activity in the rest of the world, with the exception of drill ships working in regions including West Africa and the Mediterranean. Looking at our key takeaways from the presentation today, say the Americas remains a vital market for floating rigs. We see continued strong demand expected for floating rigs in South America, buoyed by long-term contracts with Petrobras in Brazil, continued development on the Stabroek Block offshore Guyana, and the drilling offshore Suriname. Looking at Petrobras's 5-year plan, the company does expect to remain with around 30 rigs under contract, 30 floating rigs under contract going forward, which will provide a strong basis for floating rig demand in the region. We see continued activity with development drilling in Guyana, again creating a strong basis for activity there, which will be added to by activity in Suriname, Colombia, Peru, and Argentina, respectively, and the addition of independent companies in Brazil, including Shell and Equinor and BP. For the floating rig market in the US Gulf, we are expecting that market to balance in 2026 and 2027 as some rigs move out of the region for work elsewhere. The US Gulf remains an important market for high-spec 7th generation drill ships, and we do expect to, as I said, we do expect to see a continued strong level of demand there, evening out with the availability of rigs as we see in the region. As I mentioned, we do have rigs moving to other areas, including Mexico, Egypt, and the Black Sea, and potentially West Africa. So we look to see some continued movement out of the region. However, we will also see some floating rigs move back into the US Gulf in response to recently fixed contracts. So we should see the market balance in the Gulf in 26 and 27 for the floating rig market. In Mexico, there is a potential for increased floating rig activity, but the financial issues with Pemex, the uncertainty of project timelines, and a continued focus on shallow water activity mean that total demand in the area may be limited. Important things to watch in Mexico will be progress on the planned development of the Zama and Lakach fields, and the potential in the longer term for Pemex to start doing some of its own deep water exploration. The company has identified a number of prospects, and as of the government's newly approved plan for Pemex, this deep water activity will make up some part of its future activity, but there will be a continued focus on boosting production from already discovered shallow water fields. Looking at the Central America and Caribbean, we see planned exploration drilling offshore Trinidad and Tobago, boosting demand in that region. And results of that drilling program could further boost activity offshore Trinidad. Trinidad remains the more important of the Central American regions. In Central American area, although we could see one-off wells drilled in other areas, including Jamaica. Drilling offshore Canada could bring harsh environment semi-submersibles back to the region again. However, we would expect to see those units sourced from the North Sea rather than bringing in units from elsewhere in the Americas. Again, we should probably see drilling activity return offshore Canada in 2027 and beyond. And thank you all for attending our presentation today. We will now move on to the Q&A portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Matthew. A couple of questions have come in.
Great.
So maybe I can start with the first one.
Yes.
Can we expect continued movement of rigs between the Americas and other regions?
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty certain. I mean, right now we have units that have secured work elsewhere that will be moving. As I mentioned, Mexico, Egypt, and the Black Sea currently on the agenda for that. So we will see some units go from the U.S. Gulf to those areas. As I mentioned, we've got the concept of the Golden Triangle. So as kind of almost a shared pool of rigs between South America, US Gulf, and West Africa. So I think we'll also see some back and forth movement between those regions to meet demand as needed. So they're typically sort of competing for among the higher spec units as we go forward. And we are expecting to see an uptick in activity in West Africa in 26 and 27. So we may see indeed some units relocate from potentially the US Gulf to West Africa.
Thank you. A second question is, will there be continued demand for 20K rigs in the US Gulf?
Actually, yes, at the moment, both of the current 20K units are booked for the sort of near to medium term. And these are the sort of higher spec 7th gen units, and they're outfitted with the 20K PSI, BOP, and other equipment, high hook load equipment for taking on some of the sort of ultra deep water, high pressure activity there. And yeah, there's several important projects in the US Gulf that require that activity. We will see a further unit upgraded with 20K capabilities going forward. So, I mean, I don't think in the near term it's something we're going to see the entire fleets upgraded to that, but certainly for the units that have that capability, they are in demand, high demand in the US Gulf.
Maybe we have time for another question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you see impact in the reverse auction modality adopted by Petrobras for international drilling contractors, perhaps leaving Brazilian market?
Yeah, so this is this reverse auction that's being used in the current Petrobras tenders, and we've spoken to several market participants from the international level who are unhappy with this. It's a mode of bidding that's been tried before in South America, and Petrobras is bringing it back for sort of the current Buzios and Mera tenders. As we understand it, we have seen international contractors register with Petrobras. They're unhappy with this style of bidding. And I think we'll have to wait and see what the results probably of the first Buzios of this current Buzios tender are, before we see sort of the long-term effects that would have. South America remains a very important market for international drilling contractors and for the local Brazilian companies. So, I mean, I don't think there's any danger of local Brazilian companies backing off from their home market. But you could see some of the international contractors maybe looking to place units elsewhere if that style of if that reverse auction becomes the norm in the region.
Another one, Matthew, for you.
Yes,
We are
please.
likely to see a dip in activity in US Gulf in
Yes.
2026. Who will be likely from the operators to have demand in 2027 onwards?
I mean, I think you'll see continue. We've already seen drilling contracts, including Shell. We've already seen operators sign sort of long-term contracts, including Shell and Chevron in the region. So they're going to be continuing activity in there. I think, I don't see any companies moving out of the U.S. Gulf particularly. It's still an important region for many major operators. So you'll see there. I think something that we've seen a dip with recently has been a little bit less in the sort of short term, what you might call spot market work in the U.S. Gulf. There's typically a little more of that than we've seen recently. But going forward, as I mentioned, sort of Shell and Chevron will continue to work there. Talos recently announced a discovery in the U.S. Gulf. Occidental has signed some units to long-term contracts, including a second rig they'll be adding there going forward. So you'll see continued demand from those operators going forward.
Thank you, Matthew. We have reached the limit of time. A big thank you to everyone who joined us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Until then, stay well and take care.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you.